it's only the last couple of days that I felt like I was even
All right, you ready?
I've got everything set up.
Okay, I have a major question now.
Okay.
When did the Jewish nation begin? Obviously not with Adam and Eve. After Noah, I mean, when? Because at some point I'm thinking, you know, with as many people in the world, we all probably have a little bit of Jewish in it. Because we've been intermixed cultures for, you know, generations. So it's like, okay, so where did they originate? I guess it. Where did they originate?
Well, this would be a great question for Don. If he comes in today. But I would have to say at least back when they were in slavery in Egypt, because everything that they write about and all of their law system is based on the facts that they were slaves once.
Right. Well, that's what I was reading, and that's where it's like, okay, so where did it all originate? Where people, God chose them, but how did he go about choosing them, or where, at what point did he choose them? Because obviously they don't have anything, like you said, they don't have anything about Adam and Eve in reference to, you know, sin and all that other stuff. So, yeah, they talk about going back that far, but where did it actually all start?
In terms of a people, I would assume it would go back to where they were in Mesopotamia with Abraham, and they existed as a bunch of loose tribes that eventually wandered into Egypt and got taken into slavery. They didn't really exist as a nation until they went to
Egypt.
After
that's
they
where
came
they
out of
multiplied.
Egypt.
Yeah, they multiplied.
But it wasn't until David or
Moses?
Saul that they. But it's a difficult question to answer.
Come? Because of the COVID thing? I don't know. I was just curious as I'm reading this. I'm thinking, you know, I often wonder because my grandfather and my grandmother both came from, one came from Germany, one from Czechoslovakia. So they're all from that area where a lot of the Jews lived.
I guess it would depend, like all things, is if you mean when did they exist culturally as a race as opposed to a religious nation.
Well,
there we got two questions.
Yeah.
Ever adult adoption, like we had spoke about before, you know, somehow somewhere down the line where some people that weren't even a Jew, they saw promise in that person and they adopted them. That was a Roman thing.
Yeah, they could adopt them as into their family. Yeah.
I think every immigrant group that comes to America, that's Eastern European, all believe in Jewish heritage.
That's what I'm curious because
in terms of a religion, the Jewish trace their priesthood back to Melchizedek, and that's back at the time of Moses. And Aaron was the first priest, and then the priesthood of Israel is hereditary.
Right.
So that part of the religious end of it, I would say, probably began with Moses and Aaron. But as a nation, probably they really were a nation until they got to the land of Israel and kind of set up housekeeping there.
Then they kind of messed it up,
but that's always been a hard question because when someone says, you know, I converted to Judaism, well, you've converted to the religion, but you can't be a Jew because you're not
descended.
Being Jewish is a religion. It's also a race, and it's also a nation. So it's a little bit more complicated.
A way of thinking, though, it's a way of spiritual enlightenment too, because overall knowing that righteousness, doing what would be pleasing to God, is the number one thing. A different way of thinking as opposed to, I want to gain something politically or economically to benefit myself. It's all about yourself and others.
Not to change the topic, they've pretty much proven that COVID is not spread by transfer. It's spread through the air.
Okay,
So
it's not in-
all the concern about surfaces and everything is kind of going away.
Well,
But still, you don't want certain
you're
dirty hands
probably
digging in
killing
them.
a lot of other things that,
So is this your comment on my type 2 diabetes that you?
I told my husband this morning, I gotta go back to eating right. He said, what am I doing?
Let me
I'm
just-
eating gluten again.
Well, you go gluten-free.
I had
during the
chest,
week.
when I woke up this morning, I had chest pains. I was like, I'm not gonna go to church. I'm just gonna go Zoom. And finally, the chest pains
Do
went
we
away.
have anyone on Zoom yet?
where would we leave them?
We wouldn't, but we hear them hopefully.
No.
We got somebody?
Hi, Deb. This is Carol.
Carol.
I see you. Carol Parker Perez.
Ah, well, good morning, Carol. Can you hear us?
Good
okay?
morning. Yeah, I can hear you just fine. I've got you on mute because I'm out walking and I wanted to participate. So I'm out walking and I'm going to listen. And I didn't think you wanted to hear me doing that. So, so I'm zooming and listen. So that's okay with you.
That's fine.
Great. Great.
We just set up a system here where we got a Bluetooth speaker, so it's hard to hear. I'm zooming this from my phone, so it doesn't work well with the speakers there, but I got a remote wireless microphone and Bluetooth speakers, so we can hear you fine, and hopefully
I can hear you perfectly. Yep, I can hear you perfectly. Yep.
Excellent. Okay.
Yeah, it is great. I like that a lot.
Okay, and here I am. Can you hear me too?
I can, Don.
Okay, good. Good morning.
Good morning. Excellent. Well, this is going to work.
And by the way, Happy New Year. Tonight begins the new year. I don't know whether you know that.
Sure. Good morning, Don. I worked for Jess. I worked for the Jewish Social Service Agency for not a big part, 9 years of my career, and I'm well aware of all that. It's just the rabbis wouldn't have it any other way. So
good. I just want to make sure all of my Gentile friends understand that tonight is Rosh Hashanah.
It is.
We had a question that was offered up before you
I'm
joined.
going to open a can of worms.
No. When did the Jewish nation when did the Jews begin?
That's an impossible question to answer.
I was right. I said it depends on whether you mean culturally or as a tribe or as a religion.
Yeah, well, even the documents, they're very, very serious questions about history. Right now, the question of the significance of the biblical account of the kings, for example, is one of the things I'm working on right now. How reliable is the chronicling that you find in the Hebrew Bible? You have to start with that. If you want to ask actual historical questions, you have to start to ask questions like that. To me, surprisingly, that to a certain extent they are accurate. So you can go back. You can't go back, by the way, to the time of 1300 BC, when you have the supposed Exodus event. We can't go back that far. But a coherent history of Judaism goes back at least 26, 27, 2,800 years. So that's something like that for a start. But that's not a final figure. I go back to my answer that we don't really know. A lot more has to be done, even to figure that out.
Oh, good. At least I didn't give a wrong answer.
It didn't answer my question.
Anyway, what my goal here is Christians are not terribly familiar with Deuteronomy to begin with.
Right.
You could probably safely say they're not terribly familiar with the Torah, other than perhaps the book of Genesis. But the more Don got me studying Deuteronomy and looking into it, I kind of became amazed at how closely Deuteronomy links to the teachings of Jesus, to the point that Jesus was certainly educated and teaching from Deuteronomy. But then the other thing, when Deborah and I visited Monticello and Thomas Jefferson, you realize that Deuteronomy is very important in the founding of our nation, because it's very, very similar to the founding of the law in Judaism, and the fact that both Judaism and our nation are based on covenants. Mm-hmm. So I thought it, give it a little bit more variety and just not studying Deuteronomy, but attempting to relate it to both the teachings of Jesus as well as the things that relate to our nation. So kind of keep that in the back of your mind as we're going through here.
And just one other thing to keep in mind is that even though Deuteronomy now appears as the fifth book of the Bible, any version of the Bible that is, it is really the oldest version of Torah, of what has become translated as law. It's much richer concept than that, but it's the oldest that we have. And if you start at chapter 5, that's always been my advice. If you really want to give a reading to Deuteronomy, you can skip chapters 1 through 4, plunge in at chapter 5, because that's the core. The scholars agree that's it actually began. Prefaces were added later. That's why I'm saying you can begin at 5. If you start at 5, you get to some of the most ancient version of Hebrew law. Sorry to interrupt.
No, that's okay. Before we get started here, the one thing that I came across was the Torah is not really meant to be read. It's meant to be studied and discussed and applied. When you're the book I'm using is from a Jewish rabbi, kind of as a devotional series of 52 chapters, kind of a reading for each week, and it relates totally back to Deuteronomy. And he basically gives emphasis above and beyond the simple reading of the law and everything. So we're going to become Jews in this class, in that we need to be asking the question when we go through this and we hear some of the things in Deuteronomy. You ask questions like, well, why did they do that? Why did he say it that way? What's this supposed to mean? And are we supposed to follow it literally, or are there other meanings here? So it's really a book to be studied, which we're going to do. But in order to get started, in order to see how the law really is, it's very important with us being Christians is there is absolutely nothing in the Hebrew Bible about original sin. It's just not there. The story of Adam and Eve is a story about how they disobeyed, and it's actually a story of how we gain knowledge. If you go through and read it to the end, it talks about they've eaten from the tree of knowledge. They'll next eat from the tree of life and become immortal like us. So correct me if I'm wrong, Don, but the Jews don't really see the story of Adam and Eve and as how sin came into the world.
It may be partially that, but it certainly isn't freighted with all of the notions that you get in Christianity. And with that in mind, when you were speaking before, and you said we should be Jews for a moment, I would like people to bear in mind the question, which you should be asking yourself: are Christians Jews? Are they? If I'm a Christian, am I? In fact, if you asked Jesus whether he was a Jew, he would have said certainly. It was a no-brainer for him. So my question to you is, why aren't Christians, in fact, Jews? And why shouldn't they regard themselves as such? Not indeed that they can't be Christians also. They can, but aren't they part of Judaism? That's just to amplify your own question.
Point well taken. And just as an aside from that, if you talk to a minister who's been to seminary recently, most of the Methodist seminaries, Old Testament is taught by rabbis. Mm-hmm. One of the best, I think, because I've read her stuff, is Amy Jill Levine, who teaches at Wesleyan Seminary. And one of our ministers at Calvary had studied under her for Old Testament and said it was the best class that she ever had. Mm-hmm. So in the Jews, you are responsible for your own sins. You're not responsible for anyone else's sins but yourself. And with my background in Eastern religions, there's a lot of karma in Deuteronomy. The whole idea of the law is if you don't pay attention to it, bad things will happen to you, which is basically karma. You do bad things, you'll reap bad things. And the purpose of the law is to keep karma on the right side. Now, that's probably not the ways the early Jews were thinking about it, but when you compare it against other Eastern religion, it bears the same idea. We tend to think about the law as Christians the wrong way. Yeah, we tend to think about it that the Jews are obsessed with the law and they've completely forgotten about who God is and everything. And that comes from 1700 years of Christianity being the state religion of Rome. And that's another story. But Jesus actually taught that you are forgiven your sins by the amount that you forgive other people's sins. I think the proper name for it, and I'll probably mispronounce it, is shalach, is the principle that basically how you are forgiven your sins is how you forgive other people's sins.
Yeah, and that proportionality between your being forgiven and forgiving others is really the meaning of that part of the Lord's Prayer, which is a Christian prayer, but because Jesus says it, but it's Jewish through and through, very authentically so. Forgive us our sins as, that little word as is your proportionality, as we forgive those who trespass against us. It's very subtle, but there it is. It's the same thing. It's an equation.
Okay. And the refresh my speak, it is Shema.
Yes, Shema. That's in fact, that is the first word of the most important part of the Jewish liturgy. Shema Yisrael. Hear, listen, is what it means, and it's a fundamental word. Correct.
And this is what we get to in the first part of this. Now, I started out by sending the 6th chapter of Deuteronomy out to everybody. That's kind of where I started. But in essence, Moses is sitting down and talking to all the people on the other side of the side of the Jordan before they go into the land of Israel. So Deuteronomy is kind of like Moses comes out, he sits down, and he now goes over everything to refresh everybody's memory before they go into the promised land.
That's right.
In reality, if you look in, and we did this last week, talking about the history of Deuteronomy. King Josiah was basically a religious reformer. He was trying to get Israel back on the straight and narrow because they had kind of lost their way in intermarrying and worshiping other gods. And it's unclear exactly who wrote Deuteronomy and how long ago it was written before it was quote unquote discovered. But it's certainly a book that was written to reform. It's basically a reform book that fits in well with Josiah's Reformation. So the history says it was discovered, and we went over last week. Josiah tears his clothing because he's distressed that they haven't found this book. But this book is kind of a compilation of trying to bring all the things together. Moses is trying to tell all his people the things that are important. And Deuteronomy is really a game plan for the creation of a moral society in righteousness and responsibility, which ties in with, this was the same thing our founding fathers were trying to do. They wanted to create a moral country where people obeyed the law and had freedoms that the law provided. So as we go through this, we're kind of going to not only be relating it to Jesus, but to how our founding fathers looked at this.
May I add
And,
something?
Yes, sure.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry to interrupt. I have
No.
read it. I heard an interesting thing on this show called "Things You Should Know," and it was about how our Constitution, the founding fathers, used the Magna Carta as the basis for developing our Constitution, and it ties to it almost directly. And so it's interesting that you should say that. I wonder how far back Deuteronomy ties to the Magna Carta, which was so long ago.
Well, Deuteronomy
so-
was long before the Magna Carta.
Well, I know, but did the Magna Carta revolve around that as well as our Constitution, and our Constitution in turn ran on that as well? I don't know the answer to that. I was just
I'm
thinking
not sure
how
I know the
interesting.
answer to that either.
Yeah. Well, so we, how the world, the Magna Carta didn't come in the United States; it came long before that. So, it's funny how the world revolves around that very teachings in Deuteronomy, if that's the case.
Well, here are some interesting questions to contemplate as we go forward. How can you have order without slavery? How can you have freedom without chaos? How can you have law-governed liberty? How can you create structures of cooperation in a world of conflicting human wills? It really comes down to that. What the Jewish law does is not so much create a bunch of laws that people are obligated to obey. There's a reason for all these laws, and the reason is they create an orderly, moral society centered around God. So this is kind of where it's coming from. And Don mentioned the word Shema, which is the single most important word in Deuteronomy. It appears 92 times. And it's simply the word that says hear. As we're going to see, hearing is very important in Deuteronomy because the Torah expects us to understand why certain things are commanded or forbidden. And in Judaism, if you think about it, it's the teacher who's the hero. What is a rabbi? He's a teacher. And perhaps Don can answer this. When you go to synagogue on the Sabbath, is it more about worship or more about learning?
Well, yeah, I unfortunately have to say that the way things have evolved, too much of Judaism is liturgical these days. But among the Orthodox, it would be true that there's still a lot of study and learning. But that's every day. The Shabbat is very, very special in that you have to set aside your ordinary work. So I don't even know the rules that the Orthodox impose in that context.
Okay. Well, what I'm going to do is I handed out the 6th chapter of Deuteronomy, and I'm just going to read certain parts of it because I think you need to see the flavor in which it was written. So I'm starting out with Deuteronomy chapter 6. And this is the instructions, the laws and the rules that the Lord your God has commanded me to impart to you to be observed in the land that you are about to cross into and occupy, so that you, your children, and your children's children may receive the Lord your God and follow as long as you live all his laws and commandments that I enjoin upon you, to the end that you may long endure. This is a very important concept of teaching your children. It appears repeatedly in Deuteronomy. Not only you learn, but you teach your children this, and it gets passed down, whether it's verbally or in written form. This concept of teaching your children appears repeatedly in Deuteronomy. And then we get to verse 4, which is the Shema, which is, Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and with all your might. Take to heart these instructions with which I charge you this day. Impress them upon your children. Recite them when you stay at home and when you are away, when you lie down and when you get up. Bind them as a sign on your hands and let them serve as a symbolic on your forehead. Inscribe them on your doorposts of your house and on your gates. That's rather an emphatic, I mean, not only do you learn them, but you need to be close to them at all times.
And liturgically, that passage is read at every Jewish service. That thing you just read, and you shall love the Lord your God, and all the things about instructing your children every day. If a pious Jew goes to synagogue every day you will hear that. And on the day of your bar or bat mitzvah, you say that at the moment before you read from the Torah. It's the most important instruction that is contained in Deuteronomy, the one that you just read. You say it in Hebrew, of course, but I still remember it by heart in Hebrew.
I recognize this when I was working for Perkin-Elmer about 20 years ago. We made a call at Yeshiva University, and every room I went into, literally, on the side of the door, there was a little glass vial with a scroll in it. And I asked the rabbi about what is that, and he read this passage to me. Literally, it was on every door frame at Yeshiva University.
Well, sure.
And if
the mezuzah.
Go ahead.
No, it's all right. It's called a mezuzah, and yes, so Jews will put them on their door. My brother finds me a scandal because I don't have one. Yeah.
Well, the other thing, there were obviously Orthodox Jews here, and they had black boxes on their foreheads and on their wrists, and this is where it comes from. The Orthodox, I imagine, where I think they're called phylacteries.
Yes, and that's the Greek of it. Yes. That's what they're called, and on the arm also, they wrap it on the arm. They follow it quite literally, and it's a quite elaborate thing. And some of the Jews who are into trying to convert, the ones like me to something more orthodox, they will accost you on the street and offer to do that, to wrap you in them. Here in New York City, that is.
Yeah, I mean, as Christians, we need.
I was going to get my cup of coffee.
In terms of how important this must be to the Jews, in terms of learning and what this statement is. Now, if you'll recall, Jesus quotes this statement verbatim in the parable of the Good Samaritan. The Pharisee comes up to him and asks him, what is the greatest commandment? And Jesus quotes the Shema. So certainly, Jesus was very much aware of this, and it's made its way into our Christian New Testament. So this gives us a framework to see just how important this was to the Jews. And then I'm going to jump down here to verse 12 that says, "Take heed that you do not forget the Lord who freed you from the land of Egypt, the house of bondage. Revere only the Lord your God and worship him alone, and swear only by his name. Do not follow other gods, any gods of the people about you. For the Lord your God is in your midst, is an impassioned God, lest you anger the Lord your God to blaze forth against you." So again, this will be a recurring thing. A lot of the why as to why the law is there, when people ask, why should we do these things? It's going to come back to, remember when you were slaves in Egypt. When Jesus makes comments about to treat aliens and to treat the widow and the orphan with kindness, that is generated specifically from the remembrance of when they were slaves and how you should treat other people. Let me just see where we want to go here. I'm going to jump to verse 20. When in time to come your children ask you, once more again with children, when in time to come your children ask you, What mean the decrees, laws, and rules that the Lord our God has enjoined upon you? You shall say to your children, we were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt, and the Lord freed us from Egypt with a mighty hand. The Lord wrought before our eyes marvelous and destructive signs and portents in Egypt against Pharaoh and all his household. And us he freed from there, that he might take us and give us the land that he had promised on an oath to our fathers. Then the Lord commanded us to observe all these laws, to revere the Lord our God for the lasting good and for our survival, as is now the case. It will be therefore to your merit before the Lord our God to observe faithfully his whole instructions as he has commanded us. Note, it says, you do this for our lasting good. The purpose of Deuteronomy and the law is to create a moral society under God. And that's rather unique. They're probably the only nation around that has a covenant with God. And that's where we're about to go next here. We're going to look at the teacher as hero. Again, you see the references to teaching your children, and your children needs to teach their children and everything. The teacher is very much a revered person in Deuteronomy. You have to become a nation of educators. A new word enters the biblical vocabulary. The verb LMD, I'm sure that's a translation from the Hebrew alphabet. Note also the Hebrew alphabet doesn't have any vowels, it's just consonants. But LMD is the word meaning to teach, and it's some things that supposedly occurred. The word first appears in Deuteronomy, this concept of teaching as being vitally important. Jews became the people whose heroes were teachers, whose citadels were schools, and whose passion was study and life of the mind, which is rather phenomenal. Judaism is part religion, part scholarship, is the way I would define it. And the scholarship is just as important as the religious connotation, because it's teachers who shape society. That's an insight the Jews had that has sustained Judaism for longer than any other civilization. Think about this. How long did the Roman Empire last? More than 500 years?
Almost 1,000, really.
Yeah. I would say 1,000 as an empire. 1,000 years.
As an empire, not as 1,000. About 500, right? Right.
So the Roman Empire is probably still the longest-lived empire that the earth has seen. How long have the Jews been around as Jews? And think about what has happened to the Jews. They were put into slavery. They came out, created their own land. They were taken into captivity and defeated multiple times. They were then persecuted through the Middle Ages and wound up having 6 million of them killed in the Holocaust. Yet Jews still exist today all over the world as a fundamental religion that has been almost unchanged, probably, depending on going back to Eileen's question of when did the Jews start, 2,000 years, I would say, as a modest, possibly 3,000 years. That's a long time. That's the longest lived group of people centered around a culture or religion that I think have ever been. So, and I would assume if you ask a Jew, they would say it's because of the law and the covenant. That's what made this happen. So that's what we get into here as we come next to the next section of, am I pronouncing this right, Don? Devarim?
Devarim.
Devarim, which
Yes.
means words.
That's right.
words are incredibly important to the Jews because it's what binds them to God. And that's why Deuteronomy starts with words. It talks about nothing but words. So, but it's words that make and once more, I'll probably mangle, a Kadash.
Yeah, the vowels will shift in that word. That's a fundamental word, meaning holiness, blessing. The Kiddush is the most important prayer on the Sabbath. Those are it's always, as you said, consonants, and the vowels. The shift in the vowels means that you can take the same basic consonants and make different words. That's a fundamental triad, a three consonant form. The K, we would say the D, and the SH, which is one letter in Hebrew. That's three. So you get many words out of that having to do with holiness.
Okay. Well, we didn't read the first chapter of Deuteronomy, but Deuteronomy starts with the sentence, "These are the words Moses spoke to all Israel in the desert east of the Jordan." The opening sentence is all about these are words. And this is what makes it so important. Go here.
Remember how important the word is in Christianity also. Logos gets translated. Yes. It gets translated into the Greek word logos, which is the central word at the very beginning of the fourth gospel of John. And it becomes a very central concept in Christianity also. The word as fundamental.
So just to relate back to what I was saying a little while ago, there are basically three types of political structures that are differentiated by the way they come into existence. The first one is conquest. That has the conqueror at the top, his agents in the middle, and the people underneath. So that's the first type. The second type is called organic development. And that means that you go from families to tribes to large national structure. And in this type of organic development, elites emerge. And then the elites take control. The elites are identified either by their knowledge, their wealth, or their power. The last one is by covenant. Covenant societies emphasize the deliberate coming together of humans as equals to establish societies that reaffirm their fundamental equality and retain their basic rights. And this is what was in the back of the minds of the founding fathers of the United States. Thomas Jefferson, when we went to Monticello, he thought his greatest accomplishments, there were three he thought that were his greatest accomplishments that he wanted written on his gravestone. And none of these were being president or ambassador to France, but the first one was the writing of the Declaration of Independence as a document that set forth the principles of our nation. The second one was the creation of the University of Virginia, which goes back to the teacher as hero. Thomas Jefferson thought that you could not have a moral society without it being an educated society. A society that was not educated could not comprehend the law and the things that you needed to have to produce an orderly society. The last one was a document he wrote about religious freedom. And those are the three things that are written on his gravestone that he thought were worth putting on his gravestone. Nothing about being president, nothing about being vice president once, nothing about being ambassador, nothing about all the political things he was involved in, which kind of speaks volumes about the man.
Yeah, don't forget, that included the Louisiana Purchase. So there's a lot there, that's right.
Yeah, I mean, that's very interesting. You really, if you ever get a chance, visiting Monticello is well worth the day. Take all the guided tours that they offer because it gives you not just an insight into Jefferson, but an insight into how how our country was literally created.
And Jeff, to get back also to your point, to get back to the main trunk about covenant, and Carol's point about Magna Carta being related, it certainly is. It is foundational to our English concept of law. Don't forget that also the Plymouth Compact, the Mayflower Compact, that was so fundamental, that preceded also agreements were the fundamental form of constituting a society.
Okay. So think about these three ways that societies develop. Conquest represent the politics of power, while organic development, the politics of the elite. Covenant is the politics of the word. And a covenant is something where two parties agree to follow what's written down in the covenant. It's a mutually binding promise, which is what the Constitution is. Because when you get right down to it, it's nothing but words on a sheet of paper. It has no power. It has no army behind it. It just has ideas. And especially, I don't want to open up this can of worms because we could be on it for hours, but think of all the problems that we're having now in the modern world with the way people are thinking about what America is and how it was created. And you see how difficult it is to maintain a covenant when there's not mutual agreement and there's not educated people that understand what's behind the covenant. So anyway, let me go here to the
education system doesn't teach it.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. The comment, if you didn't hear it, was the education system doesn't teach it anymore. In high school, I had 2 classes of civics. Now, it was taught by Mr. Butterworth, who was probably the most single, boring person on the face of the earth. But I now appreciate it as an adult. I had no appreciation for it while it was being pounded into my head. It was one of the least interesting classes that we had, but now, as I've grown older, I have a much better appreciation for it, and I kind of walk around listening to stuff that's on the TV going, don't these people know anything about, how our country was founded? Just a simple statement, we were made a Christian nation. The United States was not developed as a Christian nation. None of the founding, Thomas Jefferson started out as a Church of England. He was an altar boy. But Thomas Jefferson was raised during the Enlightenment, and he gradually weaned himself away from it to the point that he literally rewrote the Bible because he thought it was rather disorganized and it needed to be put in a more organized fashion. So we now come, I think we have a few more minutes here. And this I don't know. Tzedek, Zedek?
Tzedek, and you get a lot of words from that also, that combination of letters, including tzaddik, which is the word for a person, the holiest person, the most learned and holiest of people. The best of the rabbis are called tzaddik, tzaddikim, the holy ones, as it were. Go ahead.
According to this, the word means justice.
Yeah, it means justice and mercy, as you say. It all the good things are combined in it. Yes.
And I'm going to read one verse here from Deuteronomy 16:20, which jumps ahead a little bit, but it's the phrase, justice you shall pursue, so that you may thrive and occupy the land that the Lord your God is giving you. What do we think of when we hear the word justice?
Think of somebody being punished for a crime they've committed, and they're getting at least
That's right.
somehow
what they're due.
What they're due.
And
It shouldn't be mean that.
Like fairness, I mean, there's a fairness to.
And that's actually what's called retributive justice, kind of equaling the scales of someone did something wrong, we're going to punish them because they did something wrong, maybe they won't do it again. But this is retributive justice, and we think of it in terms of our legal system, where people that have had some injustice done to them basically want to have quote unquote justice, but retributive justice is just a stone's throw away from being vengeance. In other words, I want them punished because they made me miserable. That is not what Zadok means here. It's termed distributed justice, and it's literally the heart of all Jesus's teachings. Everyone should be treated the same. There are no elites. Everything should be, all ideas should be held in common. All people should benefit one another to create a moral society. And that was literally the heart of Jesus's teachings, and why he said we should do certain things. It's probably epitomized both in the parable of the Good Samaritan and the parable of the prodigal son. Probably pointed out better than most. The concept of justice is inseparable from love. Doing what is morally right rather than simply what the law strictly requires. There's a lot of discussion when you look at the law, and there are, I think, I got 613 of them. There are 613 mitzvahs in Deuteronomy. And most of the discussion that evolves around them is their statements, but how do we obey these statements? What do they mean? What does it mean we should do in our life? How do we observe them? And if you carefully read the New Testament, Jesus' debate with the Pharisees is not an opposition where I'm right and you're wrong. It's an interpretation type of thing. And the Pharisees, they get written in a way that contrasts them with what Jesus is doing. But we tend to think of it as an adversarial relationship, and it really isn't. It's a discussion of, how do you think we should obey this law? It's rather vague. What would be the best and most moral way to discuss it and obey it? And that's what comes into the conversation. What's morally right to do? Can you heal a sick person on the Sabbath? Is it better to heal the sick person if someone considers it work? Or do you not do it because it is work? This is the type of discussion that the law prompts, is how do we go about doing these various commands in a socially just way? The one key thing about justice, which is burned into our judicial system, is it needs to be impartial. No one is beneath the law. No one is above the law. It's applied equally to all people. And that discussion is raging to no limit right about now in terms of, are there privileged people in the law? But in the Jewish Torah, there is no distinction between rich and poor, powerful and powerless, homeborn or stranger. Equality before the law is the translation into human terms of equality before God. So that's a key component here as we go through and discuss Deuteronomy. These are things that we're talking today that I think you want to keep in the back of your minds. It will get tough because Deuteronomy was written at a certain point in history. And there are I don't even know how to describe, strong admonishments there that we would not so much agree with today, but would make some sense when you look at the history of the Jews and where they found themselves at this particular point in history. And that's why the law is still debated today amongst rabbis. There's the written law, which is what's in the Torah, and there's the oral law that is the 2000 many years of interpretation of the written law to make it relevant to the current times. And there's one last sentence here that I'm going to read that's one to ponder. I'm sorry. I missed one other section here. In Isaiah, you find an interesting phrase that tells you what God gets angry with. And I'm reading from Isaiah 1:11 through 15. The multitude of your sacrifices, what are they to me, says the Lord? When you come to appear before me, who has asked this of you? This trampling of my courts. Stop bringing meaningless offerings. Your incense is detestable to me. I cannot bear your evil assemblies. Your new moon festivals and your appointed feasts my soul hates. You have become a burden to me. I am weary of bearing them. When you spread out your hands in prayer, I will hide my eyes from you. Even if you offer many prayers, I will not listen. Well, that's kind of harsh.
That's what the prophets were all about. Yes, the prophets were harsh.
So I read this as what God doesn't like is empty religious rituals, because empty religious rituals get you nowhere in terms of obeying the law to create a moral society. And Isaiah is not the only one. There are almost exact phrases in numerous prophets. One or two of them we ran into, Steve, when we were studying the minor prophets. But what gets us to the end here that I think is very relevant to today is the statement, when moral standards begin to break down in either business, finance, trade, and politics, a kind of collective madness takes hold of people. And that statement is made of the law that's in Deuteronomy is trying to prevent that from happening. And I think it's always good when we can put it in terms of what's happening today and not just something that was done 2,000 years ago. I think this helps bring it closer to us. And the final statement, when morality is missing and economics and politics are driven by self-interest alone, trust fails, society's fabric unravels. This is how all great civilizations began their decline, and there is no exception. So words to keep in the back of your head.
We're there.
So we're right at 1:15. And Steve and I have to run and set up the church and everything. So we will not have Sunday school next week. It's the church picnic, and Steve and I will be setting up for that. So I will send out a reminder to everybody that we're not having Sunday school next week, but we'll continue the week after that. And I'll send out a PDF with the stuff for that week's lessons.
Thank you, Jeff.
Guys on Zoom for attending.
Thank you for arranging this, Jeff. It's great. Great to be with you.
Yeah, always.
And I'll be recording it, so I'll send out how you can access it.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. Have a great week. Same to you.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Ready.